Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, Mads Pederson is on a roll, Evenepoel's back to doing Evenepoel things, Kopecky is doing featherweight climbing things, and Cavendish is back winning sprints. There's a lot to get through, so let's crack on. This week in the world of racing, we learnt that Remco Evenepoel is back in the pro peloton. At least he was back in the peloton for a while, until he wasn't.
Remco Evenepoel going, here we go. We waited for this moment. James Knox was at the end of his tether, Robbie, and we have liftoff.
We also learnt that Lotte Kopecky is the new Queen of the Mountains, or Mountain as the case was, at the UAE Tour on Saturday.
150 metres to go to the top. Lotte Kopecky, the world champion, is going to come to the top of Jebel Hafid and take a mountaintop finish. What a battle with Bradbury. But Kopecky, what can you say about this rider? The world champ takes the stage.
She really can do it all, can't she? And finally, we learnt that the conditions in Provence last week were just a little bit slippery.
Ooh, that hurts. That hurts the man bits.
That was nuts. On to the Tour de la Provence then. I think it's safe to say that Mads Pederson is on a bit of a roll. By stage 2 on Friday, he had won 4 races from 6 days of racing so far this year. 1 GC, 2 sprints and a prologue. He's a versatile lad, isn't he? 2 days later, he'd taken a further stage win and another overall GC, meaning he's got 6 wins from 8 days of racing so far in 2024. 56.3 kilometres per hour was the average speed that he did over the 5k course on the opening day, enough to give him a 6-second winning margin over his young Swedish teammate Jakob Söderqvist. 1 day later, his team delivered him to a bunch sprint win ahead of Axel Zingle and Canadian neo-pro Riley Pickrell, but it was his win on Saturday that was the most impressive. On a tough day out, Pedersen was without teammates in the finale, and so he just did everything himself. Firstly, he drove the chase to catch Marco Frigo in the final 500 metres, then he basically led himself out and finally sprinted to the win, again in front of Zingle. Crosswind shredded the peloton on the 4th and final day of racing, but Lidl-Trek were once again in the driving seat with most of their team in the first echelon. However, Pedersen met his match that day. Decathlon 82R's new recruit Sam Bennett looks like he'd got it, and I couldn't quite tell whether he'd run out of legs or whether there was just a moment's hesitation when he thought he'd won. Either way, a very brief moment where he got back in the saddle cost him the win, which went to Tom van Asbroek of Israel Premier Tech, and that was his first win in close to 5 years. The overall went to Mads Pederson, of course, who's been the man of the early season. In his 8 days of racing so far this year, his worst result is 9th, and he's taken more wins than Visma, Lease, Ineos, Alpecin-Deceuninck and Bahrain Victorious combined. Now, admittedly, it is early days, and they weren't the biggest of races, but that is still seriously impressive. Most decent pros would be happy with that tally by the end of a season, let alone by the 11th of February. I'd have been happy to have won that many races in my entire career, let alone in the space of just 2 weeks. Pedersen's main goal this year, he stated, is to win another monument this spring. And with the way he's going right now, you certainly wouldn't bet against that, even against the Galacticos of the sport. On to the UAE Tour now, and in the absence of Charlotte Kohl, who was unable to participate due to sickness, it was difficult to see anyone beating Lorena Wiebes in the 3 expected bunch sprint stages. And that was the correct assumption to make in the first 2. Her team delivered her perfectly on stage 1, where Karina Schrempf's late attack was brought back before the finish, and again on stage 2, where she outsprinted Consonni and Caponi in what was a much closer battle. On both occasions, it was Lotte Kopecky who was the final lead-out rider, and the world champion made it clear that she was there to try and win the overall classification. Now, that wasn't outside the realms of possibility, but with the GC set to be decided on Jebel Hafid, it did seem quite ambitious, given the calibre of pure climbers in attendance. Now, if there's anyone who can live up to their own lofty ambitions, though, it's Kopecky, and as we saw at the start of the show, she duly delivered. It wasn't that she completely dominated and just rode away from everyone, but she was always in with a shout of the win there. By her own admission, Niamh Bradbury's attack with just under 3Ks to go caused a little bit of panic, but Kopecky gradually reeled her in, and the Australian was no match for her in the sprint. Now, it's not that Kopecky has never shown signs of climbing prowess before. She put in a great display at the Col de Tourmalet at last year's Tour de France, for example. But this is the first time she set her stall out to win on a climb as hard as Jebel Hafid. The fact that she delivered must be quite worrying, I would say, for all of her competitors. It now seems like there are no limits to what she can achieve in the sport. She's already ticked off a lot of classics and major titles on the track, but could her ambitions now lie in winning the world's biggest stage races? Time will tell, but the other interesting predicament for the season is how her team, SD Works, deal with the ambitions of all their star riders, of which they have many. Kopecky and Wiebes already proved that they can work well together in the sprints last year and already this year, but how does it work with Demi Vollering at Liège-Bastogne-Liège, for example? It's a nice headache to have, I guess, but that will be one of the interesting storylines of 2024. And the other interesting development at some point will be where those two riders are next year, with both of their contracts ending at the end of this season. Anyway, back to the race, and it wasn't a clean sweep of wins for SD Works. Unusually, the other teams didn't do all the chasing for them on the fourth and final stage, and despite their best efforts, they didn't bring back all of the breakaway riders. The last woman standing was Amber Krak of FDJ Suez, who just managed to hold off the fast-approaching Lorena Wiebes to take what was her first ever Women's World Tour level win, so congratulations to her. For Kopecky, it was her 36th career win, the overall classification, but her first overall stage race win at World Tour level. The first of many? Quite possibly. I've still got a lot of racing to get through, so I'll move on now to the Figueira Classic, which marked the first competitive outing of the year for Remco Evenepoel. Now, you never know where somebody is going to be in their first race after the off-season, but we didn't have to wait long once live coverage started to discover that Evenepoel is still where we'd expect him to be, i.e. on another level. Soudal Quick-Step set him up perfectly, whilst Evenepoel was like a coiled spring waiting to be let off. And in trademark style, he attacked with 54 kilometres to go and was never seen again. You get the feeling that there's a sense of inevitability amongst his peers. They're kind of waiting for his attack and know there's not a lot they're going to be able to do to stop it, go with it, or even bring it back. Credit where credit is due, though. A young phenom, Isaac Del Toro, tried to bridge across solo, but it was a chase that was in vain. Evenepoel eventually crossed the finish line close to 2 minutes ahead of everybody else. Start as you mean to go on, as they say. Runner-up on the day was another young Belgian, Vito Brett. He's in his first year at a World Tour team, Intermarché, having spent the last couple of years with Team Flanders Baloise. Moving over from Portugal to Spain now, as there were a couple of one-day races there at the weekend. On Saturday at the Vuelta Murcia, there was another solo win, but one much less expected than Evenepoel's. Ben O'Connor delivered Decathlon 82R's first win of the season there, going clear with Tim Wellens at around 40 k's to go, and then dropping him inside the last 15. No mean feat that, particularly in February, a month that Wellens normally owns. It was the first win for O'Connor in almost 2 years, and very well timed, given that his contract ends this year. Not a bad negotiator there for his agents. Yesterday, it was the Classica Almeria, which marked the first road race of the year for Wout van Aert. He and the rest of Visma Lease bike were there working for their sprinter Olaf Koy, controlling the race for much of the day. It was a chaotic finale, though, to say the very least, and nigh on impossible for any team to take full control. Nevertheless, Koy and Van Aert managed to find each other in the closing kilometre, and the Dutchman went on to take his first win of the season at his first race. It almost wasn't, though. Koy was a little too confident at the finish and came close to the embarrassing nightmare of an early celebration. He knew it, and we had to wait for the photo finish to see whether it was him or Matteo Moschetti who'd won. This, though, is the moment that's going to stick most in my mind from that race. Adrien Petit of Intermarché getting off his bike to attend to Manuel Penalva, one of the riders who crashed heavily in the finishing straight. Thankfully, Penalva was not as badly injured as most of us feared and eventually got back to his feet. But it was just lovely to see that care from another rider. They're all aware of the dangers they put themselves in every time they get on their bikes, but being next to someone who's crashed badly like that must just be a horrible reminder of that. Speaking of the dangers of the sport, Florian Vermeersch crashed heavily in Murcia on Saturday and sustained a fractured femur. We wish you a swift and full recovery, Florian. Right, yet more races to get through. The Tour Colombia concluded yesterday, and it wasn't won by one of the nation's superstars. They still had plenty to shout about, though, with Colombian riders winning 4 of the 6 stages and placing 8 riders in the top 10 on GC. The first of those stages was on day 1, Fernando Gaviria taking the win there for Movistar, whilst Harold Tejada of Astana took the stage in the overall lead 1 day later. Newly crowned national champion Alejandro Osorio took the spoils on stage 3, and it was there that Rodrigo Contreras went into the leader's jersey, and he never relinquished it. Despite the best efforts of Richard Carapaz, who took stage 5 and second on the GC, Contreras retained the lead all the way through to the end. For him and for his team New Colombia, that must feel as good as winning the Tour de France, I'd imagine. The other big story of that race was the win of Mark Cavendish on stage 4. Now, there's the obvious caveat that it wasn't the strongest field of sprinters at the race, but it was as much the lead-out that was impressive as the win itself. Michael Murco and Cees Bol couldn't really have delivered him any better in the closing kilometre. I can't wait to see them up against the biggest sprinters teams in the next few weeks. I'll finish on road racing with the Tour of Oman, which is still ongoing. In the prelude to the main race, the Muscat Classic, Finn Fisher-Black took a flyer solo and held the bunch at bay, and he did exactly the same thing on stage 2 of the actual race. Luke Lamperti was second on both occasions, and he was second again today in what was a drastically shortened stage due to the weather. Now, it'll be a less bitter pill to swallow today, though, as he finished second to his teammate, the young French sensation Paul Magnier, and also went into the leader's jersey. Stage 1 of the race was won by Caleb Ewan, a much needed and morale-boosting win for him. And the race will conclude on Wednesday. Finishing as it does on Green Mountain, that will be where the overall victory is decided. I will finish this part of the show with an update on World Tour team wins. And on the men's side, even though it's only mid-Feb, there's now only one team who are yet to take a win. Cofidis. And that's quite unusual because normally at this point of the season, there's still a handful of teams yet to get themselves off the mark. So the pressure's kind of off for a lot of the teams, except for Cofidis. Topping the table with 9 wins so far are Lidl-Trek, the majority of them coming from Mads Pederson, of course. Jaco Alula sits second on 7, whilst UAE and Soudal have 5 each. In the women's, there have been far fewer days of racing so far, but despite only having raced 4 days so far this year, SD Works are already on top with 4 wins, 3 stages and the GC at the UAE Tour. AG Insurance and FDJ Suez sit just behind with 3 wins each. In cyclocross, Niels van der Putte was pretty pleased with his victory at the X2O Trophy yesterday. He got the better of Joris Nieuwenhuis there, whilst Fem van Empel continued her incredible run of victories in the women's race. Elizabeth and Lucinda Brandt were the winners on Saturday at the final round of the Super Prestige. Elizabeth also won the overall, whilst Alvarado topped the women's standings. In other news, there have been a couple of doping cases in the men's peloton. Antoine Tolhoek has been provisionally suspended by the UCI after a trace of an anabolic steroid was found in an out-of-competition sample taken last November. Tolhoek had signed to the Portuguese team Sabgal Anicolor for this season, having spent the past few with Lidl-Trek. The other suspension was for Frank Bonnamour of Decathlon AG2R due to unexplained anomalies found in his blood passport. The Frenchman signed with the team last year, but according to that team, the abnormalities were from before his time with them. You can read more about both of those cases over at globalcyclingnetwork.com. Right, that is all for now. It's going to be Sai here in the hot seat next week, taking you through the rest of Oman and the Vuelta Algarve, where Van Aert, Pidcock, Kuss, Ganna, Hirschi, Evenepoel, Thomas, Gegenhardt and Landa are all competing. Make sure you watch that one if you can, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.